at Utah Valley University. And Ryan, we appreciate you joining us on a very busy day when it comes to national security issues. And we really wanted to tap into you as it relates to Vladimir Putin's speech today, where he announced that they would withdraw their participation in the nuclear arms treaty. Give us first just a little history of that for those who may not be familiar with START, and then what's kind of the lay of the land? What does that really mean for us?
Sure. Yeah, the New START treaty is really the last in the formal treaty arrangements between the United States and Russia that deal with arms control. So this has a long history. There was the SALT treaties and the START treaty. The New START treaty was signed in 2010 by the United States and the Russian Federation. It limits the nuclear warheads for both parties at 1,550 long-range nuclear warheads, allows inspectors from both countries to inspect nuclear weapon sites. And so it really is that kind of continuation of tradition between these two countries on limiting the amount of nuclear weapons, limiting the testing of nuclear weapons, and allowing for inspections between the two countries.
Yeah, and so as you look at what that means practically rolling forward, some people are saying, well, this is more Vladimir Putin, just pure rhetoric. But what are the reverberations out there in the national security space and some of the people that you talk to?
Yeah, it's not good. It is a continuation, too, of this downward trajectory in the relationship between the United States and Russia. And you're right. This could just be another case of Putin rhetoric. Certainly, that's been rampant over the past few years in particular. But even over the past 20, there's been this resurgence of kind of Russian recalcitrance in the international community. But it also is a bit scary, when Russia's actually talking about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, signaling that that they feel that this is an existential question for them, and that of course, nuclear weapons, especially tactical nuclear weapons, are on the table. This comes at a time where there's ongoing military operations going on, a very defensive Russia, and a Putin that seems more used to kind of getting what he wants and willing to do things that he has not been in the mood to do in prior years. So it comes in a space where there's a lot more question marks and a lot more risk than before.
Yeah, one of the questions I've been dying to ask you in the aftermath of these speeches today, both President Biden's speech and President Putin's speech, but in President Putin's speech in particular, curious just from your experience in the Pentagon and again the circles that you run in, how do you think this is playing with the Russian people? It seems to me that a lot of them are just trying to keep their head down. Those that are really frustrated and maybe even very worried that this is now a real threat to their lives. Most are only protesting to the point that prevents them from going to jail or off to an education camp. But how do you think this is playing internally that Vladimir Putin has ratcheted up the nuclear threat with the Russian people?
Yeah, well, the Ukraine war has been a complete and utter disaster for Russia. Putin knows it. The country knows it. And so I think he's trying to signal strength to a Russian public that knows that they're failing, that the war has been a disaster for them. And they felt it. The Russian people have felt the weight of the sanctions. They felt the weight of, the international community really pushing hard against Russia and it really showing up in all aspects of their lives. So I think Putin doing this is, again, kind of showing strength to the people, but I don't know that it's going to work in shoring up support at home. There's been a really robust propaganda effort in the Russian Federation to, show that this is a necessary war and to show that Putin is wisely conducting the case of the war. But the Russian people know that at least they have the capacity to know that it's not going the way that it was supposed to go. Showing that they might use nuclear weapons is certainly a shift, but I think it's a shift in Putin's mind in showing, resolve and showing real national strength and again, kind of that equality with the United States that they so desperately want.
Derek Overstreet here from the New Millennium Group. Listen, what I'm hearing a lot of is that folks would love to have an income plan that is specially made just for them, that provides an income stream that they cannot outlive as long as they're living. If you'd like a copy of one, give me a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370 or utahsfinancialplanner.com. We're standing by right now.
As you look at things moving forward, what are you looking for on the kind of the strategy front from a national security standpoint? What are the things that you're going to be watching, both in terms of what happens here in the U.S., but other things that might happen inside of Russia that might give us some indication of where things really do go next?
Well, so I think everybody's going to be watching to see if the actions match the rhetoric. And so far they have not. So Russia has talked a lot about using nuclear weapons. This latest development of suspending a treaty, which is not the same as withdrawing from it, but it is an important move. But we're going to be watching to see, does Russia move its nuclear assets in a way that shows aggression, shows willingness to use or intent to use? We're going to be paying real close attention to that. On the U.S. side, I think what we're going to be looking for is, efforts to sort of slow this down, efforts to ratchet this back a bit. This is back to kind of that Cold War mentality where we want to be very careful that we don't misplay the dangerous game here. We want to not overreact to things. We do want to suggest and demonstrate that things are unacceptable and things that are not helpful or productive, but we don't want to, kind of play the game that Putin is playing and go tit for tat and ratchet up a situation that's already very tense and could go really badly if it's played the wrong way. So I think, U.S. diplomats are going to try to shore up support. The West has to be united here. NATO has to be united here. But we don't want to overplay things in favor of Putin's kind of recklessness and chaos that he's trying to create in his situation to his benefit.
Yeah, not misplaying that dangerous game is the element of the day. And then just real quickly, Ryan, just final minute. Let's add the China component in here in terms of what they're sort of alluding that they might be willing to do. Again, national security standpoint, what does that mean, and what are you watching for on the China front as it relates to Russia, Ukraine?
We're just hoping to keep China out of this. We've got our own issues with China. This balloon incident and some of the other things that have happened over the past few years have created some tensions with China. We want to keep China out of the Russia conflict. And frankly, I don't think China wants in on the Ukraine conflict. There's no real benefit to China in intervening in a war that's already going the wrong direction. So I think it won't be very difficult to keep them from really participating in it. Whether they show more support for Russia, either in rhetoric or in support, that's another thing. But, that's our primary objective with China in this conflict. It's just to keep them out of it.
All right. Great insight as always. Ryan Vogel, Associate Professor and the founding director of the Center for National Security Studies at Utah Valley University. Ryan, always appreciate your perspective. Thanks for weighing in today.
Glad to be here.
Really important things to keep in mind there, that it is a suspension, not a withdrawal from that START treaty. That's important language. It's very nuanced, but I think it's an important thing because it gives Vladimir Putin some rhetorical wiggle room where maybe this is just more saber rattling from Vladimir Putin than a real threat in terms of using tactical nuclear weapons in particular. So we'll continue to keep our eye on that part of the equation. And again, appreciate Ryan Vogel from Utah Valley University helping us dissect some of that. A lot of folks had kind of forgotten about some of the treaties, and really the START treaty is kind of the last of the nuclear treaties, and an important one for everyone, not just for the Ukrainians. That is a global threat. And a very reckless rhetorical move from Vladimir Putin in his speech today. All right, we're going to go ahead and step aside for some bottom-of-the-hour news. Coming up, we're going to take a deeper look at the China component to all of this, China's relationship with Russia, and how the U.S. can counter some of the challenge. And on U.S. economic relations with Asia, he currently is the chief economist of the China Beige Book. And just some great writing and some great thinking, as always. And obviously on a day like today, Derek, where we've got lots of rumblings from President Putin and President Biden delivering a speech in Poland, and China obviously making overtures of a President Xi trip to Moscow in the spring. Give us a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of where are we really as it relates to China?
Well, let's start with Ukraine. The Chinese simultaneously don't want to be tied up in Russia's war on Ukraine. I mean, they didn't start the war. They didn't want the war. They don't want to be dragged into it in any significant way. But they also don't want the Russians to lose. because the Russians are much more on their side than they are on our side. They see the United States, Chinese Communist Party sees the United States as its biggest external threat. So they're kind of caught here where they want to show support for the Russians and encourage the Russians and say, hey, hang in there, but they don't want to be dragged into the war. And that's why you get things like trips rather than, real Chinese assistance to the Russians in Ukraine.
Yeah, so important to look at that. And I love in the A New China Playbook, which you have there at AEI. I want to go down some of the components that you've been calling out as it relates to China, things that we really need to be looking at and considering kind of holistically, starting with the economics of it all. Give us a sense of where China is economically and what the state of the world means to them.
So there are two kind of contradictory ideas here. One, China's not taking over the world economically. They have significant problems. They had problems from their zero COVID policy, which prevented a lot of economic activity. They're aging rapidly. They've run up a lot of debt. We've run up a lot of debt here, and China's actually run up more. They don't want to let their private sector innovate because the Communist Party is afraid of the private sector. So a lot of weights on the Chinese economy. And we've seen that if you follow China. It's growing much more slowly than it was 10 years ago. We'll continue to see that. 10 years from now, we might have a difficult time recognizing China as an old, slowing economy as compared to now. The flip side of that is that does not make them less dangerous economically. It probably makes them more dangerous. They're going to try to steal more intellectual property from the United States. They're going to try to coerce countries to give them the resources they want and to cut favorable trade deals. So China's not a juggernaut, but it is an economic risk.
Yeah, and dig into that just a little bit more for me, will you, Derek? What does that mean in terms of the dance we have to do in terms of our economic interconnectedness with China?
Well, it's a dangerous thing for us to be dependent on the Chinese. And the example I always use is pharmaceuticals. The Chinese are the globally dominant producer of the chemicals that go into the pharmaceuticals. So they don't necessarily make the pill that's on your shelf, but they make the chemicals that go into the pill. And if they stop providing them, the pills disappear. So if we get into a confrontation with China over Taiwan, where China wants to take away the democratic rights of 24 million Taiwanese the way they did in Hong Kong and use force to do it, if that happens, hopefully it won't, they're going to threaten us economically. They're going to say, do you like your pharmaceutical products? You want those to be available? There are other things, but I'm using pharmaceuticals as an example. This is not a good situation for the United States to be in. China is run by a cult of personality dictator named Xi Jinping, who intends to stay in office until he's dead. And if you read the Chinese press every day, as I do, you see him treated in a way that looks like a movie villain. What did Xi Jinping do today? How can I be more like Xi Jinping? These are really things that show up in the press. You don't want to be dependent on that person. Yeah. And pharmaceuticals are an example. There are plenty of others, but that's the risk we're running here, where we're too dependent on China. Why are we too dependent on China? Because it's profitable, because they make low-cost chemicals that keep drug prices lower, as an example. So we have this trade-off of economic gains now versus risk later.
Yeah.
Derek Overstreet here from the New Millennium Group. Listen, what I'm hearing a lot of is that folks would love to have an income plan that is specially made just for them, that provides an income stream that they cannot outlive as long as they're living. If you'd like a copy of one, give me a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370 or utahsfinancialplanner.com.
Right. I mean, I've talked about chemicals for pharmaceuticals that are helpful to people. There are also chemicals for pharmaceuticals that are really unhelpful to people and deadly. And the Chinese are the dominant producer of those chemicals too. So fentanyl would exist without China, but there would be a lot less of it. It would be a lot harder to get. You can't really negotiate with them, this particular Chinese government, over them. They're always going to want something more. Well, you want us to crack down on fentanyl shipments? Well, they're not hurting our people. Why should we do that? And then they're going to demand something unethical or immoral. Stop talking about the concentration camps in Xinjiang. Don't have an alliance with a country near us because we don't want you to. We're going to have to handle this ourselves. We cannot, the Chinese, I don't think it was intentional. I think it was an accident, but nonetheless, COVID started in China. They've been lying about it nonstop for 3 years. You're not going to get their cooperation on this without giving up something you really don't want to give up. So fentanyl is something that we have to try to take care of ourselves without looking to China to help us out. Not easy, but again, that's the same thing as with regard to being self-reliant for prescription drugs. It's interesting. China has certainly taken a diplomatic beating in the last few years. I'd like to say it's because of their dangerous behavior, but I think it's actually because of their weaker economy. Mm-hmm. And if their economy comes back after zero COVID, I think their diplomatic stature could rise again in the world. Right now, people don't see China as that economically valuable, so they don't listen as much to various Chinese demands. But we'll see if this is a good year for the Chinese economy, whether their diplomatic space will expand and we'll get more Chinese lying about COVID and threatening other countries and so on.
Yeah. And let's jump to a second to what is it that President Xi fears, especially as it relates to the West or to the United States, because clearly he feels pretty emboldened in a lot of spaces. Taiwan, I think he seems to be playing the waiting game and looking for an opportunistic moment. But is there anything that they fear at this point in terms of the West or the U.S. specifically?
Yeah, I mean, Xi Jinping, as I said, wants to stay in power till he's dead. There's no successor. He's in his 11th year as head of the party. He's never bothered to name a successor because a successor might replace him, and he doesn't want that. What's the main threat to that? Remember, I said the United States is the biggest outside threat. The main threat to that is unhappiness within the Communist Party, that people are going to get tired of him, and that is going to happen. You can't stay in power forever. He doesn't seem to have an exit plan. So where does the United States come in? We come in as his fear of us is that we'll back opposition within the party and opposition within the country, that we're a threat to his political position. He's not thinking about what's best for China first. If he were thinking about what's best for China first, his COVID policies would be different. His treatment of the private sector would be different. His treatment of his own people generally would be different. There'd be a lot less surveillance. He's thinking of his own position, we're the most powerful ally that people within China who don't like him could have. So that's the number one concern he has about the U.S. We're not going to start a war over Taiwan. That's in his control. I want to do it. I don't want to do it. I want to do it 5 years from now. But what's not in his control is the opposition he's caused in his own country, and that's where he sees us as a threat.
Great insight, as always. Derek Scissor, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focused on China and Indian economies there, part of a new China playbook, America's chance to exploit the CCP's failures. Great insight, Derek, and I know we barely scratched the surface. We're going to have you come back and do a deeper dive on some defense and some of the human rights issues there as well, but we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to come back and enjoyed it.
Great insight there in terms of what's the China component to everything going on. And this has been a day where we have seen just how challenging this interconnected world that we live in can be. From China to Russia to Ukraine to our allies in Europe to the rest of us all around the world. It is a complicated and complex world that we live in. It requires a lot of nuance. It can't be summed up in a social media post or a tweet. It cannot be done by yelling and screaming at each other. We have to go past headlines. We have to dig into the policy. And ultimately, we have to get to the principles that allow us to continue to live together, to recognize our differences, to make sure that the values that matter to us, that we can live those within our country, and that we can make sure that no dictator can invade, take away sovereignty or freedom or self-determination. It's complicated and it's complex, and we'll continue to break it out and break it down here on Inside Sources with the best of the inside sources from across the country and around the world. We're going to go ahead and step aside for a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to look at what's going on right here in Washington, D.C., Russia, and even China, all in the mix, along with the United States. And one of the things we always try to do on this program is to not just chase the headlines and the tweets and the social media posts and the angry this and that happen when we have big global news, but to make sure we have time to step back a little bit, to digest a little bit, and then to frame it in ways that makes the news make sense and help all of us get to a space where we can understand it a little better and be able to understand and recognize what our role is in all of this. And so I want to take a segment to just do that today, to just dig in a little bit. There's so many moving parts and pieces to everything we experience, from the president going on a historic trip, 10 hours each way on a train to get into a war zone in Kyiv, spend hours on the ground with the president of Ukraine, and then back on the train, back into Poland, and of course a very timely speech at the one-year anniversary coming up this week for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so that started over the weekend. And then, of course, the dueling speeches of today. And then we've got China weighing in, and actually China sending their ambassador to Moscow while President Biden was in Kyiv. So all kinds of dueling things going on there. And so I want to break this down just a little bit for a few moments and look at what this all means, all of these parts and players and pieces, and what it means in this changing puzzle we have of politics around the world. And I want to start with something we haven't spent a lot of time on today, and that is Vladimir Putin's speech yesterday to the General Assembly. And 2-hour speech, so count your blessings that you didn't have to sit through that one. He blamed the conflict, the invasion by the Russian forces into Ukraine territory, squarely at the feet of the West, of the Ukrainian government, and the United States.
The responsibility for fueling the Ukraine conflict, for its escalation, for the number of victims lies completely with Western elites and, of course, with the current Kyiv regime. As I said, the West has turned against Russia not only a military and information force, but also an economic one. But it has not achieved its goals anywhere, and it will not. Moreover, those who initiated the sanctions against Russia have punished themselves.
So pretty strong words there from Vladimir Putin. And again, remember the audiences that Vladimir Putin is trying to convince. He's talking to the Russian people who I think most are none too thrilled with how poorly this has been going, what it has meant, the things they've had to endure because of sanctions coming from the West. And Vladimir Putin's clearly trying to put all of that on Western aggression, U.S. aggression, and really trying to create this national moment for the Russian people that it just doesn't seem to be buying at this point. In the latest escalation of the conflict, I think this was probably the most significant thing that Vladimir Putin said today. He announced that he was suspending Russian participation in the New START nuclear treaty.
They can't be silly people. They want to deliver us a strategic defeat while crawling into our strategic nuclear objects. Regarding this, I have to say that Russia suspends its participation in the New START treaty. Let me repeat, Russia does not abandon the treaty, but suspends its participation.
Okay, very important little asterisk there from Vladimir Putin himself, being very clear to say he is not abandoning the treaty, just suspending it. So it gives him some rhetorical wiggle room as he rattles the sabers in terms of what he's willing to do. He's done this before, saying that tactical nuclear weapons were on the table when it came to Ukraine. And so today, big bluster on the front end with a little asterisk saying, well, we're not getting rid of it. We're not abandoning it. We're just suspending it for a little bit to see what happens in Ukraine. So I thought that was a very important nuance that I think a lot missed as they were going through what Vladimir Putin said today.
Derek Overstreet here from the New Millennium Group. Listen, what I'm hearing a lot of is that folks would love to have an income plan that is specially made just for them, that provides an income stream that they cannot outlive as long as they're living. If you'd like a copy of one, give me a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370 or utahsfinancialplanner.com. We're standing by right now.
Now, I want to go back for just a moment to an interview we did earlier in the program with Ryan Vogel from Utah Valley University. He laid out the direction the United States should take in response to Russia suspending that participation in the nuclear treaty.
On the U.S. side, I think what we're going to be looking for is, efforts to sort of slow this down, efforts to ratchet this back a bit. This is back to kind of that Cold War mentality where we want to be very careful that we don't misplay the dangerous game here. We want to not overreact to things. We do want to suggest and demonstrate that things are unacceptable and things that are not helpful or productive, but we don't want to, kind of play the game that Putin is playing and go tit for tat and ratchet up a situation that's already very tense and could go really badly if it's played the wrong way.
We do not want to ratchet up the dangerous game. And it is a dangerous game that Vladimir Putin is playing, so we need to navigate that very carefully. I thought President Biden was very effective today. I thought the speech, it may be one of those speeches that is better read than said. I thought the president did a good job delivering it, but to read it, it's even more powerful. But listen to President Biden. He talked about the importance of the moment, the principles that guide the moment, and how our choices now will determine the future that we end up living in.
As we gather tonight, the world, in my view, is at an inflection point. The decisions we make over the next 5 years or so are going to determine and shape our lives for decades to come. That's true for Americans. That's true for the people of the world. And while decisions are ours to make now, the principles and the stakes are eternal. The choice between chaos and stability, between building and destroying, between hope and fear, between democracy that lifts up the human spirit and the brutal hand of the dictator who crushes it.
Again, a speech worth going back and not just listening to. Go back and read it. I think there's some very powerful principles and some great guidance there in terms of where we are. Finally, I want to go back earlier in the show. Derek Scissors from American Enterprise Institute talked about China's position in all of this relating to Ukraine and what it is that China may or may not do to support Russia.
The Chinese simultaneously don't want to be tied up in Russia's war in Ukraine. I mean, they didn't start the war. They didn't want the war. They don't want to be dragged into it in any significant way. But they also don't want the Russians to lose because the Russians are much more on their side than they are on our side. They see the United States, Chinese Communist Party sees the United States as its biggest external threat. So they're kind of caught here where they want to show support for the Russians and encourage the Russians and say, hey, hang in there, but they don't want to be dragged into the war. And that's why you get things like trips rather than, real Chinese assistance to the Russians in Ukraine.